Good evening, everybody. Tonight we're doing Unit 3, which looks at cost classification and analyzing overheads. What we're going to be looking at is we're going to be looking at the full costing of a product or a unit of output and classifying overhead costs as either fixed, variable, semi-variable, or mixed. We're going to work out how, using the high-low method, how to separate the fixed and the variable costs. We're going to separate them into the fixed and variable, and we're going to look at applied overheads and budgeted overheads and actual overheads and how these three tie together. And we're going to do an allocation of manufacturing overheads and services to different departments. So tonight we're going to be looking at cost drivers and how to use cost drivers to allocate overheads to products. Okay. So we now already know that we have fixed costs, variable costs, mixed costs, and step costs. We've gone through what these different costs are, how they react differently if you produce more units or less units, and the different features of the different types of costs. If we look at manufacturing overheads, we know that fixed manufacturing overheads are fixed for the specific period, so it doesn't matter how many units you produce, your cost remains constant because it's a fixed cost. Therefore, if you're allocating the cost to the units of production, the more you produce, the lower the cost per unit. Does that make sense? On the fixed cost, so the unit changes, the amount per unit changes in inverse relation to the activity. The more units, because the cost is fixed, the more units you produce, the less the cost per unit is. Whereas variable costs, the cost per unit is constant. So something like direct labor and direct materials, it's a constant amount per unit, and therefore the more units you produce, the greater your total variable cost, but your variable cost per unit remains constant. And semi-variable or mixed costs have a fixed and a variable component. And step costs, we looked at something like rent, where you can rent a factory which has the maximum capacity of being able to produce 10,000 units. If you want to produce 11,000 units, you have to rent an additional area, additional space, which will cost you more. So that would be an example of a stepped cost. So we've done this, we've already fixed manufacturing overheads are constant, they don't change with the volume of production, they occur independently of the level of production, and they're part of manufacturing overheads. Remember that selling and admin costs are not part of the cost to manufacture the goods, they're the part of the costs of actually distributing or selling the goods. Okay. Examples of a fixed manufacturing cost is the rent per month. As we said, that it can also be a step cost because it can be fixed for a certain space, but once you've fully occupied that space and you need more space, then you're going to have to rent more area, and then it would be a fixed cost. Supervisor's salary, the supervisor will be paid a certain amount a month, irrespective necessarily of how many items are produced a month. And then you would allocate the supervisor's salary or the cleaning staff to the units that are being produced. Okay, variable manufacturing overheads change according to the level of production. So the more units you produce, the more denim you're going to use, the more your variable costs are going to be higher in total, but they will still remain constant per unit. And we also have variable costs that are part of manufacturing overheads. So what we have to do, we know direct materials and direct labor are variable costs, but manufacturing overheads, we have to split into the fixed component and the variable component in order to know how to allocate them to the units that we've produced. And that's what we're going to be looking at tonight, how to allocate the manufacturing overheads to production. So examples of variable manufacturing overheads would be the oil that we use to keep the machinery lubricated, or the servicing costs. Let's say, for example, you have an aeroplane. An aeroplane has to go through a full service every so many thousand or 100 kilometers, so that would be a variable cost. Okay. Okay, so if we look at our overheads here, this is our total manufacturing cost. When we look at our prime costs, we've got direct materials and direct labor. Those are our two prime costs. And then we've got our manufacturing overheads. So these are always variable. Then we've got our manufacturing overheads, indirect materials, indirect labor, and other manufacturing overheads or indirect costs. Some of these can be fixed and some of these can be variable. Together they make up the total manufacturing cost. No selling costs there, no distribution costs there, no admin costs there. Those are called, do you remember what they're called? Period costs. Remember? The selling, because they are the same from one month to the next, they're called period costs. Okay. Right, so now we're looking at job costing and how to do job costing. We're going to first allocate all the direct costs, and then we need to decide on the most efficient way to allocate the indirect costs. So these are your direct costs here, and these are your indirect costs here. These, we normally know we use so many 1.5 meters of material for an item. We use so much labor for an item. But these indirect materials and indirect labor and other manufacturing overheads, we need to know a systematic method of allocating them to the products. Okay, so the indirect costs are absorbed by the items produced. So we call this absorption costing or full costing, where we allocate the indirect cost to items as well. Because if you're not allocating the cost of, say for example, the rent on the factory to the items you're producing in the factory, then your costing for your item is going to be too low, not so? Because who's paying for the rent for the factory? You need to allocate the rent to the items that you're producing within the factory so that you get an accurate costing per item, and that the rent which is used actually in the production of these items is costed into the item. So when you get your selling price, you know that your selling price is going to cover all the costs of manufacture. So that's what we call full absorption costing. So here you've got your indirect materials, your indirect labor, and your other manufacturing overheads. Some of them are variable and some of them are fixed. And we need to know how we're going to allocate these costs to the items that we're producing. And that's what we're going to be doing tonight, different ways of allocating these costs. So the concept is a little bit confusing, and we must make sure that we understand it. Right, so we're going to go through it slowly and make sure we understand it. So before we actually start manufacturing items, okay, we don't know exactly how many items we're going to manufacture. We don't know exactly what the material is going to cost us unless we've bought it all up front, okay? We might know exactly what the rent is going to be for the year because we've got a rental agreement. But we might get to September and the price of petrol has gone up and suddenly the material is going to cost us more. So we have to budget, we have to plan and anticipate what it's going to cost us. So we create an amount that we use to allocate the overheads and the costs to the item. So that's what we don't have the information available. We use our best estimate based on the information we have in the past to create an amount that we can allocate. Okay, the predetermined overhead rate. So we call this the predetermined overhead rate, and that is the rate that we're going to use to allocate the overhead costs to production. Because at the beginning we don't know exactly what the costs are going to be, but we've got a best estimate, it's budgeting. We budget that we're going to have a rent of this, therefore, and we're going to produce so many items, therefore we can allocate it. So if the rent is 10,000 Rand, we're going to produce 10,000 items, we're going to allocate the rent to production at 1 Rand per item. That makes sense, doesn't it? Okay. So we need to find a suitable basis to allocate the costs, okay? And we need to find a rate that is going to work for us to use to allocate the overheads. Okay. So we use different absorption rates depending on the product or the department. Okay, so we absorb these manufacturing overheads using a predetermined overhead rate. So that's the POR, the predetermined overhead rate, which is based on normal capacity. So we anticipate we're going to produce 10,000 items. So we take the total cost divided by 10,000 if we're using the number of units as our cost driver. And then that's how we will allocate it. Okay, but if we make 11,000 items and the rent is only 10,000, then we've actually over allocated the rent, haven't we? Then we have to do an adjustment. Okay, but that comes later. Tonight we're learning about how to allocate the overheads to production. Okay, so these could be different ways that we could use to allocate the costs to production. So we could do the number of units, okay? We could use the number of labor hours used in total. So the example that I gave you where I said the rent was 10,000 Rand and we anticipate producing 10,000 units, so we're going to allocate it to 1 Rand a unit, that would be based on production units, okay? But if you think of something else like the supervisor's salary, maybe it would be better because the supervisor is supervising staff. So if there's no staff there, the supervisor doesn't have to be there, but if there's staff there, the supervisor does have to be there. So maybe labor hours would be a better basis to use to apply the supervisor's salary to the units of production. So then you need to see how many labor hours it's going to take to make those 10,000 backpacks, and then allocate the supervisor's salary based on the labor hours. And that's where it gets confusing, because you're using one driver to allocate another cost, and students get confused. So when we go through the examples, we must be very careful that we understand what driver we're using to allocate what cost. Okay, so direct materials cost we could use, for example, if we're having zips, well, zips would normally be based on production units, but if you think of the oil that we use to lubricate or cleaning of the machinery or whatever, servicing of the machinery, that could be based on machine hours. So you could allocate that cost based on machine hours. So it does get quite complicated. All right. So the predetermined overhead rate must be the specific overhead, and this is not, you don't do this as a blanket thing for all your overheads, because you might have a different cost driver for different overheads. So you've got to look at the specific overhead and the capacity or activity level of that specific cost driver. So it's not just the case of taking a cost and dividing it by the number of units and allocating it. We use different cost drivers, and we have to know what the budgeted capacity is or activity level is for that cost driver. How many labor hours do we need to make 10,000 bags? How many machine hours do we need to make 10,000 bags? What is our direct materials cost for the bags? So we must look at the overhead and divide it by the capacity or activity level to get the cost per activity item, per item, okay? Per machine hour or per labor hour or per unit, whatever the case is, okay? So these are the steps that we're going to use in applying. I don't think I put them on your handout, no. These are the steps that we're going to use in applying, in calculating the predetermined overhead rate, right? So the first is we have to select a cost driver. We're going to do examples of this so that it makes more sense, okay, on an allocation basis for applying the overhead. Then we must estimate, because we don't know in advance exactly what it is. As I say, if we've got a rental agreement for the whole year, we might know exactly what that is, but there will be other costs we have to estimate, okay? So we must estimate what the overhead is going to be for the period, which is normally a year. And then we compute the predetermined overhead rate by taking the overhead divided by the activity level. And then we take this predetermined overhead rate and apply it to production using the actual activity level. So that's where it gets quite complicated. But hopefully we're going to do an example now, yeah. So this is the first. The examples get more and more difficult as we go along. So here we have product AZ22. And we've got 300,000 Rands worth of normal fixed manufacturing overhead. We allocated to each product based on production units. So this is straightforward. Okay, the normal production capacity is 100,000 units in total. So this is the production capacity for the whole factory, right? And product AZ22, normally they manufacture 10,000, but their normal production is 10,000 units. Okay? So in order to allocate the fixed manufacturing overheads to production, we're going to take the 300,000 divided by 100,000 times 10,000, and that is going to be the total round value of the fixed manufacturing overhead allocated to this specific product. Then to calculate the amount per item, we must take that amount, I think it's 30,000 Rand, divided by 10,000 units, so we get a cost per unit of 3 Rand a unit.
Ma'am, please say that again.
Okay.
From the beginning.
300,000 units divided by 300,000 Rand divided by 100,000 units is 3, right? Times 10,000. So your total cost that you're allocating to this item must be 30,000. Do you agree?
Yes.
So you've got two columns, a column for total and a column for per unit. So your total fixed manufacturing overhead that you're allocating to product AZ22 must be 30,000 Rand. Do you agree? 1/10 of 300,000 Rand. And if the total is 30,000 Rand and you're making 10,000 units, then the cost per unit must be 3 Rand. So in the right-hand column per unit, you're going to put 3 Rand, okay? For your fixed manufacturing overhead. So not direct materials, not direct labor, for fixed manufacturing overhead. Your total is going to be 30,000 Rand. Your Rand per unit is going to be 3 Rand per unit. Yeah. Okay? The normal variable manufacturing overheads for product AZ22 is 20,000 a year, which is also allocated based on production units. So your total variable manufacturing overhead is 20,000. For how many units? 10,000 units. Therefore, how much a unit? 2 Rand a unit. That's your variable manufacturing overhead, okay? So that's the bottom line.
Okay.
20,000 Rand and 10,000 units. So your total is 20,000 Rand. Your amount per unit must be 2 Rand a unit. 20,000 Rand divided by 10,000 units. Okay. And then your direct materials is 2 Rand 60 and your direct labor is 1 Rand 20. So now you go the opposite way around, okay? 2 Rand 60 times 10,000 units will give you your total direct materials, and 1 Rand 20 times 10,000 units will give you your total direct labor. Your direct materials per unit is 2 Rand 60. So under direct materials per unit you put 2 Rand 60. Direct labor per unit is 1 Rand 20. Fixed manufacturing overhead allocation rate is 3 Rand a unit. Your variable manufacturing allocation rate is 2 Rand a unit. And your total cost per unit is 8 Rand 80 because your total is 88,000 Rand. Now in this example, we were using units of production as our cost drivers to allocate our fixed manufacturing overheads and our variable manufacturing overheads. So in all the cases, we were using 10,000 units, but we can use different cost drivers. So the next few examples, the next 3 examples we're going to be doing, we're using different cost drivers to allocate the overheads. So we need to now see if we can do that. Okay, so the actual manufacturing overheads we only know at the end of the period. Okay, so at the end of the period, that's when standard costing comes in, which we're going to do later. When we compare our allocated overheads to our actual overheads, and we see if we have an under or over absorption of overheads, under applied or over applied overheads. Okay, and then we adjust for them through an entry at the end of the period. Okay, so if our actual is more than applied, we have under applied because we haven't applied enough. Okay, if our actual is less than the applied, then we have over applied. Okay, so we need to be very careful when we choose our predetermined overhead rate that we choose the right cost driver and that we allocate it based on our best estimate of the number of units or the number of hours we're going to use or produce. Okay, so when we're allocating service costs, we need to do this in a three-step process. We first allocate the manufacturing overheads to different departments, and then once we've got them in different departments, we allocate them to different products, and then we decide what the best way is to recover the overheads using a predetermined overhead rate to allocate them to production. All right, we're going to do another lecture example now. Now this one is more difficult because we're using labor hours to allocate the overheads to production. Okay, so we have manufacturing overheads of 5,000 Rand a month, right? And we use 1,000 direct labor hours each month, right? So this is a particular item. It's just an item, job CR127, right? So this particular job, CR127, used 2.5 hours. The direct labor rate was 24 Rand an hour. So what you're going to do with this example now is you're going to first allocate your direct labor, then your direct materials, and then your overheads. And your overheads you're going to allocate based on 2.5 hours because we're using labor hours to allocate overheads to production, right? So the total overheads is 5,000 Rand. The total hours is 1,000 hours. Therefore, we can see that the overhead rate is 5 Rand per labor hour. Can you see that? Okay, so now when we're allocating the overheads to product CR127, we need to allocate it based on 2.5 hours. So I want you to put your direct materials, your direct labor, and your manufacturing overhead and calculate the full cost for the job. So we're not looking at costs per hour. I want the full cost of this job. How much did this job cost? Okay, this is also an easy one. Put the 125 Rand down. Direct labor, 60 Rand. Do you know where the 60 Rand came from? Yes. Fantastic. So it's only the manufacturing overhead that's a bit of a problem. Okay? And you take 5,000 divided by 1,000 is 5 Rand per labor hour. This job used 2.5 labor hours. 5 Rand times 2.5 is 12 Rand 50, gives you a total cost for this job of 197 Rand 50. So it told you labor hours are used to allocate the overheads to production. That means that labor hours is the cost driver. Also called absorption cost, okay? So we have to do a best estimate. So we're estimating what we think it's going to cost us, and we're allocating based on that. Right, and we use the costing in order to determine a markup. The overheads need to be allocated on a systematic basis, and there will be different bases, and some bases will be more logical. You can say, well, I don't think that labor hours is the right basis to use to allocate manufacturing overheads in this particular situation because of this, this, and this. Let's see what happens if we allocate the overheads based on units of production. Maybe it works better. Okay, so we use it to select a selling price to look at where to increase or reduce production. Okay, so you're in a manufacturing entity and the backpacks are selling 10 times faster than the imitation Gucci handbags, okay? Whereas the backpacks that you're selling are really durable backpacks and they've got a reputation and the students know if you have this backpack, it's really going to work. So we must increase production at the backpack, and where to allocate additional resources, and where costs can be reduced. So that's what this is about. Okay, let's do the difficult one now, right? Okay, so now we need to be very clear. Question 1, what is the cost and what is the cost driver? So we need to calculate the full cost for job SC161, and I think I've given you a framework to work with. So now you can just go through the framework, and first of all we must work out what the full cost of the direct labor is, then what the full cost of the direct materials is, and then we must look at indirect labor and indirect materials, depreciation and rent. Okay, so it's tricky because it's got quite a few different components, and the different components have got different cost drivers. So let's do the easy one first, okay? Direct materials. Let's do direct materials. They use 16 meters of sailcloth at 80 rand a meter to make the job, okay? Did they only make one? Yeah, it doesn't say that they made 2 or 3, okay? So this is the job, the whole job, SC161, uses 16 meters of sailcloth at 80 rand a meter. So your direct materials are straightforward. 16 times 80. So your total direct labor is 120,000 for 6,000 hours. Is that 20 rand an hour?
Yes.
Right. And they use 9 labor hours to make this, for this job.
180.
Exactly. Okay? So you've got your direct labor cost already as well. Everybody still with me? Your total direct labor costs for the month are 120,000 rand. That is a total of 6,000 direct labor hours. Okay? That must be 20 rand an hour. And we used 9 hours. Therefore, the labor we used on this job is 9 hours at 20 rand is 180 rand. Indirect labor is a variable manufacturing overhead. Okay. Variable overheads are allocated using direct labor hours per job. So this is our indirect labor cost. Do you agree? 4,800. Our total direct labor hours is 6,000. Therefore, our indirect labor cost per direct labor hour is going to be 4,800 divided by 6,000.
80 cents.
Somebody tell me what it is.
80 cents.
18 cents.
80
cents. And then we're going to multiply it by 9 because we use 9 direct labor hours. So the cost driver for the variable overheads is direct labor hours, and we use 9 direct labor hours to make this sale. 7 rand 20. Okay? Okay, let's do the machinery depreciation. The full depreciation on the machinery for the full month is 3,000 rand, and we use the machine for 2,000 hours. Okay? And machine hours are used to allocate the fixed costs, which is depreciation. So we're going to get 1.50 rand per machine hour. Do you agree with me?
Yes.
Times 4 machine hours. So our depreciation for this specific job is going to be how much?
6 rand.
6 rand. Right, now we must do indirect material. Indirect materials is a variable manufacturing overhead. Variable overheads are allocated using direct labor hours. So we must take the 1,800 divided by 6,000 is 30 cents, am I right? 30 cents per direct labor hour. Now we must take the 30 cents. We use 9 direct labor hours for this job, so we must take 30 cents times 9 to get the cost, full cost for the item. R2.70. Okay? So the last thing we have to do is the factory rent, which is a fixed manufacturing overhead, and we are using machine hours to allocate 6 manufacturing overheads. So we're going to take the 18,000 Rand divided by 2,000, and we're going to get 9 Rand per machine hour. And we used 4 machine hours for this job. So the Rand amount that we're going to allocate of the rent for this particular job is 36 Rand. 9 times 4 machine hours is 36. And then we're going to add it all up, and we're going to get the full cost for the job. So activity-based costing is a costing system that's designed for more service-oriented companies, so we're moving away from industrial to more service-oriented businesses these days, and the old costing system of allocating based on labor hours or units of production does not necessarily apply in a service industry. So they came up with something called activity-based costing to allocate costs in a service-related or less labor-intensive industry. So this is our old manufacturing environment, which was more labor-oriented, whereas the new manufacturing environment is more capital-intensive. So if you're thinking fourth industrial revolution, then we're going even more in this direction, aren't we? Okay, it's going to be more capital-intensive and less labor-intensive. The pace of production is going to be determined by machines. You've got a high level of indirect costs, whereas here you've got more direct costs, direct labor, direct materials. And in the past, markets were relatively uncompetitive and relatively isolated from each other, whereas now we've got a global economy, so we've got a far more competitive international market. Okay, so managers need to now look at what support activities are involved in making products or supplying services, and they need to then decide on the most effective cost drivers to allocate the costs to either the services or the products. So you create cost pools and you allocate the costs to those different cost pools. So it's a system called activity-based costing. So it's a little bit different. The methodology is a bit different, okay? But you still have cost drivers that you're using to allocate the costs. We're just trying to do it more efficiently, and because of that, it becomes more complicated. So it's not just a case of allocating it based on units of production. Right, so the total costs are allocated to each product or service using the relevant cost drivers. So the aim is to be more accurate and to actually look at the costs that are driving production rather than the other way around. And it helps managers to develop a better understanding of what the costs are in the business. Assists managers to look more specifically at profitability. And there is a fundamental difference between activity-based costing and job costing. Okay, so in a traditional costing system, you would trace your costs or allocate your costs directly to the items. You would still have cost pools. Okay, here your cost pools would be broken down into cost drivers. Here you've got a predetermined overhead rate. Here you've got a cost driver. But you can see that they make more of the difference than there actually is. It's just a more efficient and effective way of doing it. Okay, that's my opinion anyway. Now we're going to do the nice difficult example, right? So we've got 2 different items in this one, right? First we've got item DEH. Then we've got item DER. So step 1 is to treat item DEH separately and do DEH first, and then look at item DER, and then do item DER. Okay, so I'm completely sure that we're all going to make mistakes in doing this this example, okay? But that's part of the process, is to find out where we've made the mistakes and why, and how not to make those mistakes in future, okay? So, normal production, remember that the cost drivers are based on normal production. That's the production we anticipate or plan or budget to make. So, we plan to make 1,000 units of DEH and 2,000 units of other way around, sorry, 2,000 units of DEH and 1,000 units of DER. So that's the first thing you must know, is on top of your DEH, put 2,000 units, and on top of your DER, put 1,000 units, so that you don't get confused, okay? So these are the overheads in September in total. Indirect, variable cost, machinery depreciation, indirect materials, and factory rent, okay? These are the two items they produce. So you're going to have to split these up between DEH and DER, okay? So the fixed manufacturing overheads are apportioned based on units of production. Then the variable overheads are allocated using direct labor hours per job, and this is where it becomes complicated. Product DEH, remember we produce 2,000 of those, use 2 labor hours per unit, while product DER, we produce 1,000 of those, uses 2.2 labor hours per unit. So the important thing to know here is, what are the cost drivers? The cost driver for fixed manufacturing overheads is units of production. So your total production is 3,000 units, so that should be quite straightforward. 3,000 units in total, 2,000 to DEH and 1,000 to DER. But then you've got your variable overheads, which are allocated using direct labor hours. Let's just go back and make sure we all understand what the variable manufacturing overheads and the fixed manufacturing overheads are. Okay, indirect variable labor costs is a variable manufacturing overhead. So next to that you can put VMO. Machinery depreciation is a fixed manufacturing overhead. So next to that you put FMO. Indirect materials is a variable manufacturing overhead, you put VMO. Factory rent is a fixed manufacturing overhead, you put FMO. Then in addition, you must allocate the direct labor and the direct materials. And remember, for each one, you need to calculate a cost per unit. So you're going to calculate your total costs per product, and then you're going to divide, in the case of DEH, by 2,000 to get a cost per unit, or in the case of DER, by 1,000 to get a cost per unit. You've got direct variable costs, which are these amounts that I've given you here. These amounts you simply allocate in full to the product. So you put your full 14,000 in there, okay, and you have 2,000 units of product DH16, therefore it's 7 Rand a unit. You put your full 8,800 in there, divided by 2,000 units is 4.40 a unit. Right. So that's your first type, is your direct variable cost, direct labor and direct materials. Then you've got your fixed manufacturing overheads. You've got 2 fixed manufacturing overheads, rent and depreciation, right? What did we say about the fixed manufacturing overheads? All right? Fixed manufacturing overheads are apportioned between the 2 products and allocated to production based on units produced. So there's your fixed manufacturing overhead of depreciation, and that's for the whole month for both DEH and DER. You produce 2,000 of those and 1,000 of those, therefore 3,000 in total. Do you agree?
Yes.
So you take your 7,500 divided by 3,000 units, the cost per unit must be 2.50 Rand. Do you agree?
Yes.
Okay? So you're going to put your cost in there. Okay, I don't want to do the labor here. There's your depreciation of 2.50 Rand. Okay? And you do the same thing for your factory rent. 9,000 divided by how much? How many units? 3,000 gives you 3 Rand a unit. You put it in, at 3 Rand a unit. Okay? And because you produce 2,000 of these units, you put 5,000 there and 6,000 there. So those are your direct, your fixed manufacturing overheads. Sorry. Okay. Then the next thing you have to do is your variable manufacturing overheads. You've got 2 variable manufacturing overheads. You've got indirect variable labor costs and indirect materials. This is variable, this is variable. Okay? What do we say about the variable manufacturing overheads? We say variable manufacturing overheads are allocated using direct labor hours per job. And that's where it becomes complicated. Because I don't tell you how many direct labor hours you have in total. You have to calculate how many direct labor hours you have in total. The cost driver is direct labor hours. So we know that product DEH, we produce 2,000. And each DEH uses 2 labor hours. How many hours is that in total? 4,000 hours. And product DER, we produced 1,000. But every item uses 2.2 labor hours. Therefore, the total labor hours for product DER must be 2,200. So the total labor hours for product DEH is 4,000, and the total labor hours for product DER is 2,200. Therefore, the total labor hours altogether is 6,200. So we must take these amounts here, the indirect labor costs and the indirect materials, and divide it by 6,200. So 6,200 divided by 6,200 miraculously is 1 Rand per labor hour. Okay? Now, so it's 1 Rand per labor hour. But product DEH uses 2 labor hours. So that's going to be 2 Rand per unit. Product DER uses 2.2 labor hours. So that's going to be 2 Rand 20 per unit. Indirect labor is 9,300. Have you got that?
Yes.
Okay. We have already calculated the labor hours of 6,200. Are you okay with that? Okay, so we take the 9,300 divided by the 6,200 and we get 1 Rand 50 per labor hour. Okay? Now, this is for product, for all of them, 1 Rand 50 per labor hour. Now here, this is 1 Rand 50 per labor hour, but we use 2 labor hours. So we have to put in 3 Rand. Okay? This calculation here for the indirect materials was 6,200 divided by 6,200 gives you 1 Rand times 2 labor hours gives you 2 Rand. Okay. Variable manufacturing overheads are allocated using direct labor hours. We know that we had 2,000 units of product DEH and 1,000 units of product DER. Okay? The labor hours for product DEH must be 2,000 products times 2 Rand per 2 hours per product must be 4,000 hours. 2,000 products times 2 labor hours per product is 4,000 hours. Do you agree? Right. 1,000 products times 2.2 hours per product must be 2,200 hours. 4,000 hours plus 2,200 hours is 6,200 hours in total. So the total number of hours is 6,200 hours, right? And we're now going to first take the, let's do this one, the indirect materials. 6,200 divided by 6,200 is 1 Rand. Okay? But in the case of DEH, we are using 2 hours per unit. So it must be 1 Rand times 2. In the case of DEH, we are using 2 hours per unit, so the indirect labor must be 1 Rand 50 times 2. Therefore, when we get to DEH costing, the indirect materials is 2 Rand and the indirect labor is 3 Rand. This is 2 times 1 Rand, this is 2 times 1 Rand 50, because we use 2 labor hours per unit. Okay. And then the depreciation and the rent. Must I go over that again as well? Okay. Depreciation and rent. Okay. So here's your depreciation cost, 7,500. Okay. Depreciation is a fixed manufacturing overhead. It's allocated based on units of production. The total for both products is 7,500. The total number of units you have produced is, for September, is 3,000 units. Do you agree? 2,000 of DH and 1,000 of DER is 3,000 in total. If you take 7,500 divided by 3,000 units, you get 2 Rand 50. There's your 2 Rand 50. Right? And then your rent was 9,000 divided by 3,000 units is 3 Rand a unit. There's your 3 Rand a unit. Okay? This here is these figures here multiplied by 2,000. So the first two here, you have the total, you have to divide by 2,000 to get this amount here. These ones, you calculated the rands per unit, multiply by 2,000 to get that total there. You add them all up, and your cost per unit is 21 Rand 90 for product DEH 16. So what you have to do is follow the steps, okay? Divide your costs into different groupings. First, you've got your direct costs. Then you've got your fixed manufacturing overheads. Then you've got your variable manufacturing overheads. Every time you have a different cost driver for a different cost, you have to treat it separately from the other costs. And in this example, you actually only had two cost drivers. One was number of units, which is absolutely standard, and the other was labor hours, which was more complicated. Okay, so the direct labor and direct materials, you should always be able to allocate and then either do it that way around or that way around. In this case, you were given the totals. You have to divide by the number of units to get the cost per unit here. Okay. And these ones you have to calculate the individual amounts and then go that way to get the totals. Okay. So 21 Rand 90 is your cost per unit for DEH 16. So for DER 16, you were given the 8,000, you were given the 4,500. Okay. The depreciation here stays at 2 Rand 50 and the rent stays at 3 Rand. Okay. So these ones are the same as for DEH. These ones are different because this indirect materials was 1 Rand per direct labor hour, and this product, DER, used 2.2 labor hours. So this must be 1 Rand times 2.2. Okay? This is 1 Rand 50 times 2.2. So the amounts are the same, 1 Rand and 1 Rand 50. The difference is that here you're using 2.2 labor hours on each unit. So you must multiply by 2.2. So this becomes 2 Rand 20 and that becomes 3 Rand 30. Therefore your total is 23 Rand 50. When we have a cost, a manufacturing overhead that consists of a fixed component and a variable component, and we need to separate the two components because we have to treat fixed costs and variable costs differently, we can do that using the high-low method, and I know that you did the high-low method at undergrad because I taught it to you. So this is how we do it. We take the highest total cost minus the lowest total cost and divide it by the highest total units divided by the lowest total cost. The highest total cost minus the lowest total cost divided by the highest total units divided by the gas. So, for example, if the variable costs are 12 Rand 40 and the fixed costs are 10,000, if we make 1,000 units, then the total cost is going to be 10,000 plus 12 Rand 40 times 1,000 units. You agree with me? 22,400. That's straightforward. If we make 4,000 units, the fixed costs are going to stay the same. 10,000 plus 12 Rand 40 times 4,000 units. If we make 10,000 units, the cost is going to be 10,000 stays the same plus 12 Rand 40 times 10,000 units. Therefore, when we're given these amounts here, okay, if we're given the 134,000, okay, and we can then subtract the 22,400. There's the 134,000, there's the 22,400, okay? This difference here must be due to the variable cost because the fixed costs are the same. Okay? So we take the difference between the highest and the lowest. The difference must be due only to variable costs because the fixed costs remain the same. So the difference in units here is 9,000 units. Can you see that? So we can take the difference in rands divided by the difference in units, and it will give you the rands per unit, the variable cost per unit. So the difference between 22,400 and 134,000 must only be due to the variable cost. You agree? It's the variable cost for 9,000 units. So this difference of 111,600 is the difference for 9,000 units. So if we take this 111,600 divided by 9,000 units, we work out that the variable cost per unit is 12 Rand 40, which is what it was, 12 Rand 40. So we can use the difference between the costs to calculate the variable cost per unit. And it's really very, very straightforward. So now we're going to take the highest minus the lowest. There's the highest minus the lowest, okay? So you're going to take the Rand value, the total cost, highest minus lowest. You're going to get the Rand amount there. And the difference is 250 units. You're going to take the Rand amount, divide by 250 units, divided by 250, is 13 Rand 20. Okay, so we've calculated the variable cost at 13 Rand 20 per item. So now we first have to calculate the component that is the fixed cost. Do you agree? Okay, so the way that we do that is that the fixed cost must be the total cost minus the total variable cost. Okay? We're going to take the fixed cost here of total cost of 2,800 and the variable cost is 100 hours times 13 Rand 20 is 1,320. Therefore, the fixed cost is 1,480. Okay, so the first thing is, let's go back to there. Okay. So we got a variable cost per item 13 Rand 20. You agree?
Yes.
Right. Now, I've asked you to calculate the total fixed cost at an activity level of 100 hours. There's the 100 hours. The total cost is 2,800. Okay? The total variable cost must be 100 hours times 13 Rand 20. Okay? So 1,320. So of the 2,800 Rand, the variable cost is 1,320 Rand. Therefore, the fixed cost must be 2,800 minus 1,320, 1,480. Back again? Okay, so where did we start? We started with this question, right? We said that this is the total cost for these items. We produce 100 items that cost 2,800 Rand. we produce 350 items that cost 6,100 Rand. Okay? The difference between this and this can only be due to the variable costs. Okay? Because the fixed costs are going to be the same no matter how many items you produce. Okay? Therefore, we take 6,100 minus 2,800. That gives us the total variable cost for how many units? The difference is 250 units. So we say 3,300 divided by 250 units. That means our variable cost per unit must be 13 Rand 20. Right. If our variable cost per unit is 13 Rand 20, then our total variable cost for 100 units must be 1,320. So now, if we look at this 2,800 Rand, it consists of a fixed component and a variable component. Do you agree? Right. How much is the variable component? Well, it must be 13 Rand 20 times 100 Rand is 1,320. Okay? So, if the total variable cost is 1,320, then the total fixed cost must be 2,800 minus 1,320 is 1,480 Rand. So we can use the high-low method to calculate the variable cost, and we can also use the high-low method to calculate the total fixed cost. So we can calculate the total variable cost for that number of units, therefore we can calculate the variable cost per unit. Okay, so the first thing we do is identify the difference between the two amounts in rands and the difference between the two amounts in units. Okay? Then we divide the one by the other to get the variable cost per unit, and then we can then calculate the fixed cost at any level of activity. Okay, it's been a hard lecture tonight. You've done well. Thank you very, very much.